Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The two, the biggest lie is where this war came from. And I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the U.S. rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. You get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts. But we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh, yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO. And the Iraq War was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally, Assad, with the CIA regime change operation. And oh, yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border. And not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the U.S. Conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the U.S. government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then. It started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the U.S. poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Newland, have been part of this story since 2014 and really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Newland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the U.S. pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Newland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the U.S. government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game? It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, and they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me. But the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Would you agree that China is using this Hamiltonian approach to economics, perhaps coming from Sun Yat-sen, whose influence who is highly influenced by Hamilton?
Well, China has what I would simply call a mixed economy, which means it's partly state-directed, partly market-directed. I think all successful economies are mixed economies. And the U.S., even when it uses free market rhetoric, of course, has a large role of the government, not necessarily accurate role, but a large role of government in the economy. Different countries come down differently on how they carve up the relative weights and responsibilities of public, private, and civil society sectors. It's true that the UK, US approach is relatively more on the laissez-faire side. I'd say relatively more. We're lower taxes, certainly as a share of national income, a much lower social outlays. The UK more than the United States, even though it started with laissez-faire in the 19th century. The UK adopted a national health service, of course, after World War II. The United States never did that. China's a very pragmatic and economically well-governed country. Very impressive during the past 40 years because they've had a planning model with a major role of state finance combined with a very dynamic and competitive market sector and a very entrepreneurial lead in many sectors as well. I was just in China and noted a huge rise of electric vehicles. And there are hundreds of electric vehicle companies right now, startups. It's expected that the number will whittle down quickly to perhaps between 5 and 10 such companies. But right now it's named to be in the hundreds of companies producing electric vehicles. And it's a fiercely competitive market inside China. Now, when it comes to the international side, China's just doing a lot of things that the United States did for a while after World War II, which was help finance infrastructure abroad, make the way for U.S. multinational companies, in fact. And China right now is doing that. The United States doesn't do much internationally at all other than war, but it doesn't do peaceful economic development activities, and you can see in the rhetoric of American leaders, politicians, their resentment that China dares to help other countries to build infrastructure. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very valid and quite beneficial win-win program of China, together with more than 150 other countries, by the way, is badmouthed every day by the United States, mainly out of resentment and jealousy, because the U.S. doesn't have that kind of spirit to make connections with other countries, and China is making massive investments and working with other countries to help them with developing an electric power grid, basic renewable energy sources, fast rail, 5G technologies, paved roads and highways, and many other desirable things that those counterpart countries really need. Now Biden is talking about a road project from India to the Mideast. And he's so proud of this one road. It doesn't exist. It's not financed. It's it may be a good idea, but it's a little pathetic, actually, to tell you the truth, because China has dozens of projects like this all over the world. The United States has thought about one. Literally, I guess they took the one belt, one road idea, but they took one road. There's one corridor that they're talking about, whereas China is doing dozens of these projects. So the U.S. is kind of looking on.
I think that IMEC program is dead with the war now. Yes,
I think that's right. And we're so paralyzed, so ineffective, so paralyzed with everything, so war-driven, that an idea of a road becomes about the best that we can do, and a road that perhaps never will be built.
Right. Okay, well, look, I'll come back to China, but I also knew that you were at the Valdai discussion club. And I was told actually by Richard Sakwa, whom I interviewed yesterday, whom you know, he was also speaking at Valdai, but he told me that you were speaking there on the question of the discussion for a new currency and a new international trade mechanism that's taking place within the BRICS. I think you know that Sergei Glaziev, who has been a key economist in formulating these ideas, working with China and the other BRICS countries, and now really the whole global South working on putting together this kind of idea. And you probably know that Lyndon LaRouche, that Glaziev has openly praised Lyndon LaRouche's economic ideas, and especially the article he wrote in the year 2000, which was called Toward a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency. So perhaps you can say a bit about where you think that whole plan stands today. I was not able to find the video of your presentation at Valdai, so I'm counting on you to fill us in.
Basically, I noted that having one dominant currency in the world, which has been the U.S. dollar after World War II, and which was the pound sterling before World War I, has certain advantages because money is just a means of settling transactions for the real economy, for the non-monetary economy. So having a single currency can be efficient, but the U.S. Has blown it by weaponizing the dollar. The U.S. Had an advantage because other countries and international businesses use the dollar, and that does give benefits to the U.S., so-called seniorage benefits and other benefits, but essentially the ease of borrowing abroad and very high liquidity of your own national currency. But the U.S. started to weaponize the dollar, meaning rather than letting it be used just for transactions purposes, the United States used this special situation of having transactions pass through the dollar banking system and ultimately through the central bank of the U.S., the Federal Reserve, to start confiscating the dollars of other countries that the U.S. disagreed with in foreign policy. This is really obnoxious behavior, by the way, because the idea of money is, again, as a transactions medium, not as a hostage to foreign policy. And because the dollar was so dominant, even after the U.S. confiscated reserves of Iran or North Korea, then Venezuela, now Russia, many countries use the dollar, but they don't like to use it because they're a little afraid of saying a word that's crossed to the U.S. and then seeing the U.S. government come down on them, even freezing their money. It's pretty bad behavior, in my view, but basically very ill-advised because the BRICS countries now, and it started with the original five, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now it's going to include the new six, which is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran. This is a big group of countries, and they're saying we don't want to use the dollar because, frankly, we don't want our money confiscated. And so they're going to develop an alternative payments system. They will be successful at that because it's not so hard to make payments in other ways, in renminbi or in rubles or in rupees or in an R5 currency, so-called, because the original BRICS 5 all have an R currency. The real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So they call it the R5, and they may just make a basket using those five currencies for denomination and even for lending and borrowing in a bond denominated in a basket of currencies. So I expect something interesting and good to come out of this. Again, it's a little bit regrettable in a way if having a single medium of exchange, it wouldn't even have to be one country. Keynes had the idea that it would be the IMF's currency, the Bancor, he called it in a famous writing, would have certain convenience. But if it's then used monopolistically for militarized or foreign policy or geopolitical purposes, it's not going to last long because there are always workarounds when it comes to trade and to financial settlements. And that's what the BRICS are doing right now. They're going to do a workaround.
I sent you just before we got on this call a article that was published by Glaziev, I think just today or at least recently, on this, in which he emphasizes that while the basket of currencies and the R5, these are definitely being implemented already in various forms, but that eventually the idea of a separate currency, maybe the R5, but some separate currency which would be also tied to a basket of commodities rather than just currencies, to, in a certain sense, tie it to the actual cost of production of the real economy. And that in general, he thinks this is something that it's basically simple to finish completing it, that he's hopeful that it can be done by next year when Russia is head of the BRICS and will be holding the BRICS conference in Kazan, I believe. So anyway, I'd be interested in your response to his article.
I haven't read it yet. Let me just say that there are several different issues involved in our discussion. One is the privilege of the U.S. to host the international currency, and I've explained why the U.S. has misused that privilege and why it's now going to lose a lot of the business, so-called, of settlements in dollars. But a second is the mechanics of payment systems, and the third is the management of monetary policy. These are all distinct issues. On the payments mechanisms, we can do something that could never have been done before, and that is digital settlements. So we don't even need a banking system now, and we don't need cash in circulation or gold bars and other or gold coins and other mechanisms that were mechanisms of settlement, because now digitally every transaction can be tracked. We know there are different ways to do it. Blockchain is one, but there are many other probably more efficient ways to do it with central bank clearing, for example. And that means that even the method of payments, I think, will likely be digital and could well be a central bank digital currency in the future. Then the third question is the management of monetary policy. And this is a long debate. John Maynard Keynes wrote brilliantly about it in the 1920s and the 1930s. Should a currency, whether digital or physical, be convertible into something else, for example, gold, or into some commodity basket, or should it be what economists call a fiat currency, which is that it is only backed by the policies of the central bank or banks that issue that currency, and its value depends on expectations about those policies. And we've had more than 100 years of debate about that. The advantage of linking a currency to a commodity basket is it can't be issued for political purposes, especially to finance government payments not backed by a flow of tax revenues, for example, so you can't get a hyperinflation in a backed currency. And that's been deemed to be the advantage, that it is a kind of straitjacket and focuses on the real economy, limits the capacity to issue credit. But on the other hand, it proved to be highly disadvantageous in other circumstances. When the world was on a gold standard or a gold exchange standard, if there were long periods in which major gold deposits were not discovered, that gave, on average, a deflationary weight to the world price trends, and that was deemed to have distributional and real economy effects that were not highly desirable, although it also had some desirable effects as well. It also made it harder for central banks to be lenders of last resort in financial panics. And the Great Depression is a very complicated, fascinating, and important subject to understand about central banking and whether the gold standard was a contributor to the persistence of the Great Depression. Well, I don't want us to get into long excursus about monetary theory, except to say that there are several questions on the table right now. First, whose currency? Second, the technology of settlement. And third, the organization of monetary policy. They're all very interesting. I spent many decades studying them, and I think there's no ideal systems here, which is why we continue to have these discussions decade after decade after decade.
Right. Well, getting back to China, I did listen to your presentation in Beijing I think it was at the UN headquarters there, to, I think probably
Group of ambassadors.
Ambassadors, yeah.
Yep.
And probably Chinese officials as well, right? But
There
anyway,
were,
yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, you really focused on the Chinese miracle, the transformation of China over a mere 40 years into, from one of the poorest to one of the richest in history, actually, and the transformation of elimination of poverty and so forth. So, I mean, this was a quite interesting presentation. What I really found interesting was your discussion of the idea that the Chinese model would be the proper approach for dealing with the development of Africa, which, of course, is also very much part of China's role in the Belt and Road. But in particular, you contrasted that directly to the policies of the IMF, which I thought I'd ask you to elaborate on here, because it was a very interesting way of showing the failure of the IMF to bring about real development in Africa or any other part of the developing sector.
I think, to put it very straightforwardly, the rapid economic growth of China, which was by traditional measures around 10% per year growth of the domestic economy, persistently between 1980 and nearly the year 2020. So an increase that was more than 30-fold, if you accumulate, in the size of the Chinese economy, came about by investment. What does investment mean? Investment means building the capital stock of a country. What is a capital stock? A capital stock means the productive assets of an economy. What are those? Well, those are three main categories. First, what we carry in our own bodies and brains, the so-called human capital. That's the education and the skills and the health of the population. The second is the physical infrastructure, which is the roads, the power grid, the fiber optics grid, the water and sewerage systems, and fast rail, highways, all of the networking that the economy depends on. And the third is the business sector, the manufacturing industries, agriculture, and so forth. Well, if you look at China's growth during 1980 to 2020, the rates of investment were extraordinary. The rate of investment means essentially the share of the national income that is invested each year in new capital. And in the United States, the gross investment rate, which means the amount of investment that we undertake, not recognizing that some of it's just offsetting depreciation, the gross investment is something on the order of 15 to 20% of the national income. But in China, it was typically 40 to 50% of the national income. So a supercharged investment rate. Before our eyes, China built thousands of kilometers of fast rail, thousands of kilometers of a highway system, thousands of kilometers of an electricity distribution system, and on and on and on. Really impressive. And that's what powered China. That plus the huge investments in education and skills. So China started without much infrastructure at all, and it started with very poor education levels by the late 1970s because China had had so much turmoil over the preceding 150 years. But then China finally, starting in 1978, said, okay, we're going for it. Deng Xiaoping came to power. He was perhaps modern history's single most successful economic reformer. He pointed China in the right direction, said, go for growth, open the economy, make a market economy, make a mixed economy, build infrastructure, invest in the people. And lo and behold, that extraordinarily high investment rate led to 40 years of rapid growth. Now, the problem when it comes to the IMF is that the IMF does not have that vision in mind. The IMF's vision to a finance minister of a poor country is don't bother us with your problems. Don't get into excessive debt. Don't get into a financial crisis, and don't bother us about your poverty. Thank you very much. So nobody thinks very hard about the way for these countries to get out of poverty, but the way is just like China did, which is massive investments. And then comes the question how to finance those investments. China partly borrowed in the early years, but also had a massively high saving rate internally. So as the income was rising, China wasn't consuming it in a lot of household consumer spending. Chinese households were saving a lot of their rising income. Chinese businesses were reinvesting a lot of their profits. The government wasn't running huge deficits on its current transactions and so forth. All of this meant a very high saving rate that could be turned into a high investment rate. Now, Africa right now has a very, very low saving rate because people are impoverished. They can't save more. They have to survive. So they need some help with the financing right now by essentially some international financing, say from the African Development Bank or from the Belt and Road program, in which China can provide some of the financing to build that infrastructure in Africa. But that's the advice that Africa should be getting. Invest strongly, invest heavily, borrow where you need to borrow, get your kids in school, electrify the economy, build the roads, build the fast rail, and so forth. And I think China can help to give some very good advice in that direction.
The China model. Right.
Yeah, China shows, you can have 40 years of supercharged growth, and that's what Africa needs.
40 years. Yeah, I agree. You also spoke at Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius. which now is a shrine and a museum, I believe, right? A major site.
Well, that temple, the Confucian temple, has been there for more than 2,000 years. And each emperor has come and added a stone, added an inscription, added calligraphy, because Confucius has been an intellectual hero and guidepost for China basically for 2,500 years. So it's really impressive to be there at a Confucius birthday party, which I was, because this goes back essentially 2,500 years, and it's a large complex of buildings because emperor after emperor added their own building to it. So you really get the feel of China's very long, remarkable history.
Right. And you focus there on the idea that we find our common humanity by studying the great philosophers and thinkers of every culture. In particular, you looked at Confucius and Buddha and Aristotle. I think I would differ with you on Aristotle and would have focused on Plato rather than Aristotle. That's a discussion for another time. But in any case, this idea of looking at the great cultures and the history, the best moments of the great cultures, is the exact opposite of so-called geopolitics, which is what guides the Western leaders today, deriving from ideologues like Alfred Mackinder and other ideologues of the British Empire. So, which their view is that the only way to advance is by putting down the other guy, the opposite of the interest of the other, and rather, and this, of course, leads to the sanctions policy. You didn't mention the sanctions when you talked about the theft of reserves, but even the sanctions policy, as I understand it, is based on the fact that people have to use the dollar in trade, and that therefore they think they have a right to impose these sanctions on countries. But in any case, China, of course, is not looking to suppress anybody else, and the massive sanctions against China and Russia and many other countries indicates a failure of thinking in terms of the great cultures and what can be done with a culture for the future. So how do we restore that looking to the great minds of antiquity in the West?
I think that there are two philosophical points that we really need to pay attention to that are quite fascinating, quite deep. One is the question of human nature, and the philosophers that I referred to, and I like Aristotle personally, but also I like the fact that Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius allow us to talk about the ABCs of philosophy. So it's getting back to the core ABCs. And what the ABCs, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius had in mind about human nature is that it is potentially good, meaning that with proper cultivation, proper education, proper mentoring, living in a decent community, people can learn to be harmonious. People can learn to be fair, trustworthy. People can learn reciprocity. So this is sometimes called virtue ethics, the idea that people can be decent, pretty good. Now, there's another philosophical strain which is deeply pessimistic. Augustine in Christian history is the exemplar of that. Man is fallen, and so man is a sinner, and there's no way out except perhaps by God's grace. But the sinfulness can't be washed away, and pessimists in history have believed that. And another pessimist like that had a huge influence is my second dimension, which is how people behave or how states interact. And Hobbes, in a way, is a follower of Augustine. Hobbes, of course, wrote in the 1600s, whereas Augustine was more than a millennium earlier than that, but Hobbes was the quintessential British philosopher who said people are rapacious, they are greedy, they are pushy, they are violent, and the best you can hope for is that someone controls them from killing each other. So he called for a very tight, centralized state for that purpose. But basically, the Hobbesian idea is that you can't do anything in a state of nature but defend yourself from being killed by someone else. And strangely enough, while British thinkers accepted that there would be a national government that would stop people from killing each other inside Britain, they took the view that internationally it is a Hobbesian war of all against all, that just countries fight with each other. And this is in the current thinking of international relations known as the realist school. And our leading realist thinker in the United States is John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. He's a wonderful person and a tremendous gentleman and a great scholar. But he thinks that countries are, and especially great powers, are inevitably at each other's throats. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that this is often the case. But John Mearsheimer says the implication of this is that the world is tragic. His most famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, because he says conflict is just about inevitable between major powers because nobody trusts each other. You can't trust each other. It's a war of all against all. It's eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. And so, yes, life's tragic. And I debate him. Again, we're friends and I admire him a lot. I want to be clear. But I say, John, we can't accept tragedy as our fate. We have to do better than that. And so I go back to the philosophers. And the philosophers taught, you can have harmony. That was Confucius's main message, which is it's possible actually to be decent. It's possible to observe what was famous for Confucius, and in similar terms for us in the Western culture as the golden rule. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. If you're a Hobbesian, you say, there goes Sachs moralizing, but that's not how the world is. I'm going to do what I can to the others because otherwise they're going to do something terrible to me and I'm going to get there first. And I say no.
Because that's human nature. That's what they are.
Because that's the deep human nature. That's inevitable.
Yeah, right.
But I don't believe it. It's certainly not the case that we're always at war against each other. We can be better than that. But by the way, China absolutely has a different history and a different mindset. And this is also a fascinating point. It's not just Confucius versus Hobbes. It's actually history. 2,000 years of statecraft. What have we learned? Well, in China, for most of the 2,000 years, there was a centralized state. This is very important. For most of the 2,000 years, there was the Han dynasty, or the Tang dynasty, or the Song dynasty, or the Yuan dynasty, or the Ming dynasty, or the Qing dynasty, or today the People's Republic of China. And for most of that 2,000 years, there was one country. And while there were rebellions and there were a lot of invasions from the north, mainly from the nomadic peoples in the dryland, grassland, steppe regions, there was one country, big population. Now in Europe, after 476 AD, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, there never again was one dominant power of Western Europe. So there was war nonstop. Think of Britain and France, for example, how many years were they at war during the past 1,000 years? An incredible amount across the channel. Now compare that with China and Japan. How many years were China and Japan at war between, well, you could take it back before 1000 AD, but say from 1000 AD to 1890? The answer is 2 years. I think it's 1274 and 1281, if I remember correctly. And there was actually one incursion a third year. Now, two of those were when the Mongols ruled China, and they tried to invade Japan and failed on 2 occasions. Once was when a shogun, a military commander of Japan, ridiculously tried to invade China and was terribly defeated in the Korean Peninsula. But my point is not that. My point is they didn't fight for 1,000 years. Barely a skirmish. By the way, when Japan industrialized and was the first industrializing nation, Japan followed the realist approach, sadly. Japan said, okay, now we're part of the imperial club. Now we're going to go invade China. And the Chinese diplomat said, what are you doing? We're Asians. And Japan said, no, 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 now we're part of the Western club. This was back in the 1890s. So Japan really behaved badly by becoming an imperialist power for some period, but China never did in that way. And if we understand the different philosophical roots, this is crucial. If we understand the different experience of Europe and China, we can come to appreciate that our mindset in the West that, well, it's war all the time, so China's an enemy, so we better go at it, is nothing the way that China thinks. And when I said to John Mearsheimer, again, I want to stress, a friend and and a brilliant scholar, when I said all this warmongering against China is going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of war, he said, yes. I said, John, self-fulfilling, we don't need to have that war. He said, yes, but that's how it is. And yeah. I said, no, we don't need to have it that way. We can do better than that. So that's the debate.
Helga issued what she calls the 10 principles for an architecture of security and development for the world as a whole. And most of them are sort of self-evident. You need education, you need cultural training, you need health, so forth. But the 10th principle is exactly what you just brought up, that the nature of man is good. And this is the one that's most difficult for people to accept or understand. But it's the fundamental one. It's really the issue, as I think you correctly just located. This is what distinguishes the idea of being committed to global development rather than global war. And of course, as you said, also the Confucian concept of harmony and the concentration on education is really the center of the Chinese development of their own country over the last 40 years. And what's now being taken out to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. And as you know, we just had the Belt and Road third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing with 150 countries represented, which certainly demonstrates that they've failed miserably in the isolation of China in the world, and that the idea that they could get countries to decouple from China has just forced most countries to say, you're crazy. This is where development is, rather than war and sanctions. And in fact, the headline of our EIR this week is going to be on the fact that Xi Jinping offered a $100 billion new investments through the Belt and Road, at the same time that Mr. Biden was offering a $100 billion investment in wars, naming specifically Russia, meaning Ukraine, Israel, the genocide being carried out against the Palestinians, and China. They included Taiwan as one of the places where this $100 billion. So it's pretty clear that they're talking about a global war. And the only question is, how can this madness be stopped and reversed?
Well, it is so unacceptable American foreign policy. And what I hope people are coming to understand is that the arrogance and the militarization of the United States that has been demonstrated time and again now over the past 30 years is not bringing security to the U.S. It has busted the budget. We've spent trillions of dollars on these horrible wars that have accomplished nothing except violence and destruction and rising debt. And they're not making America safer at all. There are more and more wars that are a reflection of this arrogance, because the arrogance has meant that American policymakers have thought, we can do what we want and we don't have to talk with anybody about it. We don't need diplomacy. We just need our military. And the military can't solve political problems. And we're finding out again and again that the military approach doesn't work to solve the deeper problems of humanity, and can't settle political issues. For that, you need politics. You need diplomacy. And I mean politics in the positive sense of getting together to work out arrangements for people to live peacefully together. So I think the failures of American foreign policy are on full display. Also, the ignorance of it, because I would cite our National Security Advisor's statement, Jake Sullivan, about a week before the violence blew up in Israel and Gaza with the Hamas attack and now the bombing of Gaza. Jake Sullivan said, the Middle East is the quietest that it's been in 2 decades. And it shows they don't know anything except what their own imagination is, and they don't understand what's happening around the world. What's happening around the world is that people want a different approach. They want development. They want social justice. They want the chance for decent lives. They don't want the militarized approach. Mike, we're going to have to go. Great to speak with you, and I have a call starting right now. Because I think we've covered a lot of ground for ASEAN, and we've heard a lot of things that are very promising. And that's good, because we need some optimism and some direction for how to overcome some of the big challenges right now. If we were to step back from our crises and look at some of the very fundamental trends in the world, we'd have a great deal of reason for optimism, in fact. The world economy and world society as a whole has become much better off than it was 100 years ago, without question. Life expectancy has risen remarkably. Income in the world, on average, is now $20,000 per person if measured at international prices, and about $12,000 per person if measured at market prices. And this is a huge rise of incomes and well-being and quality of diets, protection of healthcare coverage, and many, many other really fundamental parts of our material life. And what Dr. Zhao described for China, which is absolutely incredible, for 1.4 billion people over a period of 40 years, has been achieved not quite at that pace, but very broadly in many parts of the world. And the underlying reason for those improvements is that science, technology, know-how has advanced and continues to advance even at an accelerating rate. So our ability to address practical challenges is really unprecedented right now. Our wealth is unprecedented, and our know-how is unprecedented. This is really the fundamental reason for being very optimistic about what we can do and what we should do in the coming years. What we've learned, though, is that there are at least three fundamental problems with the way the world functions. And that's what brings us to this workshop and what brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first is that with all that progress, there are billions of people that have been effectively left behind this progress that are really struggling for a variety of reasons. People live in more remote areas or in very unfavorable geographies, or are part of minority groups that have been maltreated within societies, or half the population, women and girls that traditionally were not part of the market economy, were part of the household economy, and have definitely seen progress, but facing a lot of social obstacles still today, which is why one of the Sustainable Development Goals is directed specifically at the issues of gender, SDG 5. So one of the three huge challenges is that we have a rich world and a lot of very poor and suffering people within that world. And that's just, I think for most of us, humanly unacceptable. And indeed, when the UN was established in 1948, all of the member states agreed that there should be basic standards of life for every person on the planet because they're people on the planet, because they're human beings, and the world is productive enough to ensure the dignity of everybody. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I regard us still trying to honor that declaration, which seems to me to be the basic point. So problem number one is the very uneven development, the fact that there is still today a significant part of the world that lives in really abject deprivation. And that's a first challenge. And I think it's ethically probably the number one challenge, because extreme deprivation in a world of plenty is absolutely destructive of all of our humanity if we don't solve that problem. So that's why SDG 1 is end extreme poverty. Straightforward. And SDG 2, the second highest priority, is end hunger, for heaven's sake. Of course, there are big challenges of how to do it, but I will say in a world of wealth and knowledge, this is definitely within reach. It's crazy, to my mind, that if the average income is $12,000 per capita, there are people living at a few $100s per capita, and the world just goes on as they suffer and die young and face terrible hardships. The second big challenge, the huge challenge, the puzzle that is even harder than the first one conceptually, is that we discovered about 50 years ago that the nature of our economic development, all that wealth that I just talked about, is environmentally destructive, because the much vaunted economic processes don't take care of their physical byproducts. And some of them were not understood till 50 or 100 years ago, like greenhouse gases and their effects on climate. That required a scientific breakthrough of a quite deep order to understand that. It came by the end of the 19th century, and then it took at least 75 years to create measurement systems to verify the science. And we've more or less known from around 1980 that humanity is really changing the climate in ways that could be dangerous. And we're still struggling with that fact, because what brought us that wealth in the first place, starting in the 1800s, was fossil fuels. And then we discovered about halfway through, oh, those are dangerous. That's not good. So this is the second big problem, is that we have an economic system and a set of laws, rules, regulations, a global commons, the open seas, and many other factors of our economic system that mean that the scale of production is now self-destructive. And as I say, we've understood this intellectually at least for about 50 years. It was 50 years ago that the first conference on this fact took hold. It was 51 years ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases, not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things, rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed. Or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things. Or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward perhaps to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right. And there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time, but there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace, just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business. It's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day, but we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals, because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems. Really, it's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals, maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success. Maybe, like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them. And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do we do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is, one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases. Deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on: the biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. It happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at a ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders. We're organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Lao PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So Sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing. Training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you.